Hello everyone, and welcome to another tabletop gaming lecture. I am your host for this lecture here. I'm Jason Bulmahn. I am the Director of Game Design at Paizo, and today we are going to be talking about building your own campaign. I've done videos before talking about building adventures, building monsters, building magic items, building all the pieces that go into a campaign, but I haven't done one talking about building a campaign itself. So I thought it was high time I got around to talking about this critical skill. So the first question we have to answer is, why build a campaign at all? Why not just do a string of adventures? The answer is you totally can. For many groups, just sitting down and playing an adventure, finishing it off, going on to the next adventure is a perfectly good way to spend their time. That's what they're there for. That's what they're engaged with. But I think spending that little bit of extra effort to build yourself a campaign structure is really going to pay off. It's a way to keep your players engaged with the narrative long term, long form. Like, we all have played through adventures that we're not really all that interested in, but we play it anyway because we're there with our friends. Maybe the story doesn't involve our character that much. Maybe we built a character that doesn't work too well in that story. It happens. No worries. That's why a campaign's important, though. A campaign keeps you engaged, keeps you interested, even if that particular part of the narrative doesn't really affect you, because you're there to hear those other pieces. In fact, players are kind of hardwired to look for that bigger story. Even when you're just playing a series of unconnected adventures, your brain will start putting together pieces and being like, wait, is this related to that? That's only natural. So as a GM, you might as well play off that. You might as well build to that expectation. Build them that story that they can slowly uncover, that they can slowly put together over time. Now, basically, the main difference between an adventure and a campaign is an adventure tends to be a story that is one beat. Here is the story. There is a bad guy. He is doing a thing. You have to stop him. Great. That's the story. There's no twists and turns. There's no deeper level to it. But in many ways, an adventure and a campaign share a lot of structural similarities. The main difference being is that an adventure tends to be one beat, whereas a campaign is multiple beats strung out over time, building a bigger, deeper narrative. So an adventure is a component of a campaign, if that makes sense. But let's get to part one of our narrative here, and that is the main arc. This is the starting ground. This is where your campaign first begins. Now, the first step in building the main arc of your campaign is figuring out kind of who is your antagonist. What do they want to do? How does it affect the world? You're asking just the most basic question about your storyline. The kind of the who, the what, the where, the when. You're getting all of the basics and putting them together. Now, I'll dig a lot deeper into this as we go along, but that's just kind of where you begin. And this is an act of pure creativity. You're just looking at the game, you're looking at the rules, and you're going, who is acting? What do they want to do? And how does that impact the world? And obviously, this is usually something negative, but it doesn't always have to be. It could be that, they're trying to do something that for them is a positive thing, but its effects are bad for the world. I'll get into some examples here in a bit. But that's the first kind of question you're asking. Who's acting? What are they doing? How is it affecting the world? And kind of like, how does their moving towards their objective change the world around them? Those sorts of questions are going to lead you into the bigger picture. But you're going to want to ask yourself, kind of in this, what is the scope of the game you want to run? What's the scope of the campaign? Are you running a long campaign, something that's going to take multiple years? Are you running a shorter campaign, something that's only going to take a couple months? Where does it live in the game system that you're designing it for? Is it for lower level characters? Is it for higher level characters? This question varies and can change based on the length of the campaign. If it's something that is going to be a long form campaign, it could still start very small. You could start at first level. That's perfectly fine for a campaign. Most campaigns do start at first level. So, you're kind of asking yourself a lot of questions about the overall shape and form when you're building this main arc. Who's the bad guy? What do they want? What are they trying to do? How long's the campaign? How does their power relate to the starting point of the campaign? That kind of will help dictate how long your narrative structure is going to be. So let me give you a couple examples that we'll build upon as we go here. Let's say you have a troll that wandered upon a kind of sentient helmet that the trolls put on, and now the troll is super smart, and the troll decides, I'm going to build a kingdom for myself. That's a perfectly cromulent campaign arc seed. Maybe that's the whole story. This troll has decided to build a kingdom for trolls. I'll give you a second example. There is an elemental lord who has been outcast from the elemental planes and has landed here on the material plane and is desperate to get home despite the rules preventing him from just using his magic to get home. And he is hiding out in the nearby mountains and plans to siphon out magic and power to open up a rift to the elemental plane to allow him to go home. Perfectly good campaign seed. Let's say instead, let's go to the extreme and say there is a deity of war that wants to change the rules of death. Now, all three of these seeds have a few elements in common and a few things that are important for you to understand, and that's why I kind of gave three of them. One, you got your trolls, your elementals, and your deity of war. So all three of them, I have a clear sense of who the antagonist is. I have a clear sense of what that antagonist wants to do. And I have I'm starting to have an understanding of how that will impact the world. So if this troll builds a kingdom, maybe that kingdom is carved out of the lands that the players call home. This elemental wants to pull magic out of all the realms and use it to create a rift to the elemental plane. Well, we certainly see how that could be bad. If this deity of war wants to change the rules of death, that could have wide-ranging implications for the world. Now, you'll notice that I did something very intentionally here. Each one of these speaks not just to the power of the villain, but the scope of their plan. And this is an important thing to recognize. It wouldn't make sense if I had a troll who wanted to change the rules of death and alter the fabric of the entire world. That's one really powerful troll, and most people assume trolls are kind of a lower level threat. I'm not saying you couldn't make that story work, but I'm saying that when you're building, it's important to understand the scope and impact and how it relates to the power of the foe that you're building. And mind you, I'm mostly talking about fantasy RPGs here, where you have a stacked kind of level system where more powerful foes can accomplish bigger things. I think that as a general principle applies to most games. If you're running a vampire game, having a primogen do something is a lot different than having a prince do something, etc. Anyway, my point here is understanding the power of your villain and the scope of their plans. Those two things should feel natural together. So a deity of war is a very powerful, dangerous threat. It would do something that is very large and powerful and dangerous. That doesn't mean the campaign couldn't still start at low levels. It totally could. And arguably probably should. But you also don't have to start there. You could start that campaign at a higher level and start it further on. But in any case, it's all about understanding the scope and power of your villain and how it relates to the scope and impact of their plan. And that's kind of the key of building your first arc. And really, the campaign, the main arc, is really little more than that. Troll finds an intelligent helmet and decides to build a kingdom for himself. That's my arc. That's it. I'm done. I can move on to the next step now. An elemental lord is exiled and seeks to find a way home. Done. I'm good. I can move on. I have the main arc of my campaign. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's kind of what you're trying to build at first, is just kind of these initial components. So let's sum that up. The first step is deciding the main arc of your campaign. Who's the antagonist? What do they want? What happens if they get it? What occurs because of their actions? Next, determine your scope. How big is the campaign? How does it end? Balance the power of your antagonist to the impact of their machinations. That's it. That's step one. Simple. I mean, in fact, this is the step that trips up a lot of folks. They aren't able to boil it down to something straightforward. And I'm not saying it has to be simple. Trust me, the plot itself can be incredibly complicated. But having a good, firm understanding of how, why, where, when is going to give you a clear way to build towards a complete campaign. So let's go on to step 2. Building chapters. So you have your arc, and the next thing you really need to do is start to look at that arc and flesh it out into chapters. Now, a chapter is a discrete piece of the narrative with its own part of the story compartmentalized within it. It has its own villains, its own challenges, its own conclusion. A campaign without chapters is just an adventure, right? The chapters are really kind of what make a campaign a campaign. And the reason why these are important is because chapters give milestones to the story. They give a sense of accomplishment to the players when they're defeated. They give them an idea of the progress and the building of the narrative. It allows you to include villains and antagonists that aren't the main antagonists that they can defeat conclusively and have that kind of sense of doing something. I think this is something that's real easy for a GM to overlook, is that when you're building a story, when you're building a narrative, your job is to give the players challenges, to put roadblocks in their way. That way, when they overcome them, as they should be designed to do, they get a sense of accomplishment and achievement. That's kind of how stories are built, right? Problem arises, players move to overcome problem, they do so, they feel accomplished, new problem arises. That's the basics. But in a campaign, these chapters kind of provide nice bookends to the story, pieces, concrete, interactable components that also serve as great ways to break up the story and to allow you to change theme, focus, and add variance to the story. You know, if I go back to that story about the trolls, and I say, yep, it's going to be trolls from minute 1 to the last minute, well, I'm really just building an adventure then, because it really only has one beat. There's just trolls, and you're going to fight trolls from beginning to end. And if there's too much of that, it's going to get boring. Nobody wants to fight trolls for 14 sessions in a row. That's dull. Trust me, I've done it. So once you've got you're going to take your story and start breaking it into pieces. And the way to do this, the way to build these chapters, is to kind of approach the story from both the front and the back. Now, I personally find it most useful to start from the back of the story, to start from the conclusion, or what I see as the conclusion, and work my way toward the front. Basically, what I'm saying is, what is the villain doing? What's the villain ultimately trying to accomplish? And how do they accomplish it? If I can work back from that last step, back toward the first step, I'm going to see a number of important points along the way that are going to tell me how that narrative is building and how it's coming together. Those typically are going to be where my chapters are breaking, where the story is easily broken into segments that I can then do different things with. So I'm taking each one of these pieces and altering it and building it into a story of its own. Let me go back to those examples that I have to give you a sense of how this might work. So I'm gonna look at each one and I'm gonna break it apart so that you might see where I might take it. And I'm going to be asking, how does this further the villain's goal? How did they get there? Why did they pick these pieces? That sort of thing. So let's say I've got this troll that wants to make this kingdom. This is the smart troll. It's the troll with the sentient helmet controlling it. And the first thing it would do is subjugate the other trolls in its clan and its tribe, whatever it is, right? And it's going to get those trolls to work with it. Well, that's kind of I wouldn't say that's the end. The end is probably the troll with all of the things that it has subjugated to itself goes to war against the other nearby kingdoms to carve out a swath of land for itself. That's the end of this story, is this war with the trolls. But that's not the beginning. No. That's not even close to the beginning. The orc, the troll would probably start expanding its power by grabbing other tribes of humanoids and getting them to pay allegiance to it and getting them under its sway. It might start out small, using its small clan of orcs to gain control of the nearby orc tribe, threatening to eat them if they don't pay attention to the trolls. Those orcs might realize that they have to pay food to the trolls. The trolls are always hungry. That would be something they want early on. So they subjugate these orcs and they say, you must deliver to us, one wagon full of meat every week. Otherwise, we will use you as meat. So these orcs now become their own story, because I can say, okay, well, the orcs don't have that much meat to give, so they start raiding a nearby village. And maybe that's how my campaign starts, is actually not with the trolls at all. It's with the orcs. The orcs are raiding a nearby village. They're the initial problem. I now have a discrete part of my story to play with. And maybe that's all I need for this particular story, because trolls aren't a particularly high-level threat. Maybe it only needs 2 chapters, the orc chapter and the troll chapter, but I could certainly find more to fit in there if I want. The orcs eventually, or the orcs and the trolls eventually get some giants on their side. There's lots of different ways I could go, or a giant might be interesting, right? There's lots of things I could build individual chapters out of. Let's move on to the Elemental Lord here. He's been exiled from the plane of Earth and arrives in the nearby mountains, deep in the mountains, and begins looking at a way to return home. Let's say doing so requires a massive ritual that requires literally tons of gems. This is something that on the plane of Earth, this Elemental Lord could get at a whim, but here on the material plane, that's nearly impossible. But that's the only thing to do. So he can obviously create other elemental minions and starts using those minions to raid all of the mines in this mountain range. All of them. The earth comes alive and begins eating miners left and right. There's lots of ramifications of this that could turn into additional stories. So maybe there's a band of Durgar somewhere in the mines, in one of these mines, and those Durgar are now driven out and on the surface, and boy, that's weird. And the Durgar end up, going and taking over a hillside mine far away from the mountains. And in doing so, they drive out a nest of spiders. And you see how this, all of a sudden the nearby town that has a plague of spiders, because these spiders have been turned out from the Spider Haunt Hills, by the Durgar, who are in turn driven out by the Elemental Lord because it's trying to get the gems. It creates a series of ongoing narratives. The first narrative is the plague of spiders. The second narrative is, the haunt of the Durgar. The third narrative is the elemental caves. The fourth chapter or narrative is the throne of the Elemental Lord. And now I've got a whole campaign, and each one can have its own villains, its own power structure, its own individual narrative story. I can take each one of those and do what I've already done with the overall campaign narrative. I can take that and go, how do I build this into a wider story? It's all about kind of going from macro to micro and building the individual pieces. Those of you familiar with some of the other stories I've run will see the fingerprints of this approach all over the place. I am running a campaign right now on the Paizo Twitch called Band of Bravos. It's an actual play with some folks from Paizo. And yeah, there is elements of this story about how one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. And there is a bigger story underneath all of this. But they haven't uncovered it all yet. They're only getting fragments and bits and pieces, and they're seeing the ramifications of other actions. Let's go to that last example with the deity of war, who, wants to change the rules of dying, basically. It does this by saying it wants to have a conclave amongst the deities. And in this, there's votes that happen, and it wants to change the rules of death to say whoever dies due to your portfolio comes to you as well. You get some power out of that, as opposed to just those who are devout to you. Now, for the God of War, this is a great deal, because, people die by the scores in wars and conflict. And to ensure its victory in this upcoming vote, it's hoping to have a massive influx of power by having a lot of its followers engage in war and drum up its numbers and gain power so that it has more of a voice in this conclave. So the end result of this is that wars start springing up all around the world as the clerics of war agitate all over the place to cause strife and conflict. You could see the deep layers that a story like this could take, with agents of this deity going all around the world, creating war, creating strife. It could start out something really small, though, by just some lowly acolyte of war, like arranging for a pitched battle between two villages over a cow, right? You could take that down. You could take that huge, lofty narrative of some deity getting into the battle of between the gods and boil it all the way down to two villages fighting over a cow. You could do that. And he did it by just breaking the fence, and then, it's all this subtle arrangement and machination. And it could move up to a larger war and conflict being arranged between two nations, where the clergy of both are actually talking to each other to get both sides to engage in a war with each other. It's easy to see when you start breaking these things apart, when you stretch the plot line out, how it can be broken into chapters. And you're going to want to take each one of those chapters and start repeating this process. You want to take a chapter and stretch it out and say, what elements of the story are in this chapter? Who's the main villain? So I go back and I'm like, okay, so let's talk about the trolls and the orcs that they've subjugated. Well, the orc, the leader of the orc tribe, the matron of the orc tribe doesn't really want to be doing this. Has a good relationship. The orcs have had a good relationship with the nearby town, but now all of a sudden they're raiding farms and stealing livestock left and right. You automatically now have a more interesting story than just there's a smart troll, right? Now I have a conflicted orc chieftain who doesn't want to be doing this, who is amenable to negotiation and maybe might even be willing to switch sides if the players can help her convince the other members of her tribe to stand up against the trolls. There's lots of ways for these narratives to kind of play out, and you're basically taking each chapter and trying to decide where are the adventures within that chapter. Most chapters will only have one, but sometimes they might have more than one. And the next thing you're going to want to do is, as you start stretching this out, you're basically building what I like to call kind of the plot outline, right? So you've got your main overarching plot. Beneath that, you've got your chapters with their own adventures in them. And then this is where things get really interesting, because now you're going to want to look at building subplots. And these are entirely unrelated, or at least they should be. They might spawn off of the main plot, but they're not the story of the main plot. So if those orcs are stealing the livestock of the farmers outside this village, well, maybe one of the farmers decides himself to give up a life of farming. He burns down his farmhouse and turns to a life of crime. And now he goes and does something else and goes off on a spree of vengeance. It could be anything. It could be the Durgars drove out the spiders. The spiders came to town. They started roosting in all of the buildings and whatnot. And this disrupted an angry ghost that lived in an old haunted house. Basically, all you're trying to do is look for other stories that make sense and fit within your overall narrative, but aren't actually part of the main story. I personally find that it can get a little old if the only story you're telling, if every beat of the story you're telling has something to do with the main plot. It helps the overall narrative to have beats that don't have anything to do with the adventure you're telling. This is also a great place to seed in published adventures. short, long, whatever you want. It allows you to kind of just take pieces of things that you're interested in, that story you always wanted to tell, that adventure you always wanted to run. This is a great way to just drop those in and let them be their own story, and then have the main arc come back around it. It's a great thing to do. I do it all the time as a GM. I find that it helps make the entire campaign feel, well, a little bit more real. And one trick that I don't always, but I do like to do with subplots is actually have the first adventure be a subplot. Have the main arc be present, have it slowly begin and slowly begin to develop and mature, but it's while the first adventure is going on, and the first adventure is mostly an unrelated, fun-filled fantasy romp. Some dungeons, some monsters, something fun for the characters to kind of sink their teeth into, and to get a sense of who their characters are before they're in the real narrative, before they're making decisions that'll impact the entire campaign. Let them figure out who they are. Nothing wrong with that. You see this in movies and TV shows all the time, where it starts out in the middle of some unrelated escapade by the character, right? You know, oh, they're you know, it's a cop and his partner, and they're chasing down some unrelated criminal, and that's how the movie actually starts. And then the real plot line begins. And they do that so that you get a sense of who the characters are before the stakes matter, before the main plot comes into play. It gives you a sense, gives them a more well-rounded expression of character. Also, during this period, you're going to want to start looking for recurring characters. As you look at your plot, and as you are staring at subplots and various chapters, and you're building all these pieces, you're going to want to start asking yourself, where is this set? Who are the major players in this? Who is going to be the major NPCs? I'm not just talking about the antagonists here. I'm talking about the protagonists as well. Who is also going to be in this story, and how can their narrative wind through it? Start thinking about ways that their story can adapt and grow as part of it. This is also a really interesting place where you can start looking at a villain that you need for Chapter 3 and seeding them as a protagonist in Chapter 1 and 2. Then they disappear for Chapter 3 and 4, and they come back as a villain in Chapter 5. There's lots of interesting ways you can do that to build investment, to build story development. The more your characters, and I'm not just talking about the player characters here, the more the characters grow over time, the more the campaign feels like a building narrative. The more it feels like a real story, and not just kind of a bunch of cutouts that appear for you to knock down and then you move on to the next bag of XP. I'm not saying that you can't have a good time with that sort of story. I certainly have over my time gaming. But to build a good campaign, it's good to have your story grow and expand over time. So, you know, you're gonna want to. I touched on this just a moment ago with the recurring characters, but this is the moment where you also start looking for ways to seed the future in your story. So, what I mean by that is, you know, let's say this, you know, we've got this plot with this deity of war wanting to change the rules about where you go when you die. Maybe you can have the seeds for that happen very early on, even though it's not that important. The local cleric of this war deity is old and infirm, and although he is responsible for accidentally letting the cow out and causing the strife between these two villages, he's also been proselytizing to the player characters the entire time, telling old war stories and how the glories of war will secure your place in the afterlife. And that, you know, those who venerate the god of war, they will live on forever in the battlefields, right? And you can make this sound glorious and good at this point. You're basically seeding all of the lore they need for later. There's some great literary ways, you know, there's always, you know, the things like Chekhov's gun and things like that, where if you put a gun on the mantelpiece in Act 1, it should be fired by Act 3, right? I think that holds true for plots and narratives as a whole. When your job as the GM is to kind of seed the future so that it doesn't seem entirely out of place. If they're going along doing this entire narrative and this entire dungeon quest, and then all of a sudden this plot line with the deity shows up and it doesn't have anything to do, and there was no forecasting of it at all, Well, then what you're really doing is running a series of unconnected adventures, right? You know, if you're just running one adventure, then another, that's what that feels like, is that there's no cognitive payoff for paying attention to details. If the weird hermit in Act 1 of the story in the first adventure, you know, he's only in that first adventure, but it seems like he should have some greater role, and he's not dead at the end, but then he's never heard from again. That's a detail that they may have paid attention to, but it never pays off. It never comes back. So you're going to want to look at your plot line with the same critical eye. But it's easier to do when you're looking at it from the whole, and you can look forward and find a piece and drag it back to the beginning. That's the trick. Is you already know the future. You know where you think this is going to go. So it's easy for you to drop in hints, tips, story pieces very early on. This also prevents you, by the way, from having to do all of your exposition about what's going on and what the narrative is once the narrative begins. I think that's fine for an individual adventure. It's okay for the farmer to come in and tell you that his barn is infested with spiders that have suddenly showed up that are not from around these parts, and they've, you know, killed a bunch of his livestock, and his kid is missing, and he thinks he might be strung up in the barn in a spider's nest. It's fine for that to contain all that exposition. What's not fine is to get to the end of that narrative where the elemental lord is gathering up all the gemstones to do all this giant ritual and have none of that be explained to you before that point. Have no sense of any part of that story until literally you're playing it. That makes it just an adventure and not a campaign, because you haven't built it, you haven't seeded it, you haven't fully laid the groundwork for that story to shine through. Now, there's another important part to building the chapters here that I want to talk about too, and that's to work with your players to figure out the narratives that they're invested in, some of which come from their backstories and whatnot, and work those into the campaign as well. These might be subplots, these might be tied into the main narratives, but this is the point where you're going to want to look at your overall story and say, where can I fit in beats that apply directly to the characters that are being fed to me? The players, remember, this is the story of them, and their backstories and their histories should be important to your campaign. I know that it's easy as the person writing and the auteur of all this to think, well, my story is all that they need. And you can have a satisfying story that way, but it's kind of hollow for the players. Their stories aren't part of it. Their narratives aren't coming into play. So you're going to want to talk to them. Ask them what the deal is with their characters. Take the seeds that they give you and find ways to work them into the story. Maybe, the dwarf in the party, has an estranged brother that he hasn't seen in years who works in the mines in the nearby mountains. Well, that story writes itself. He was driven from the mines as well. And you can now interact with him later, right? Maybe one of the characters' parents went missing when they were a child. And in fact, they aren't missing at all. They put them in an orphanage because they were being drafted into an army. And now they're in a different city, right? There's so many ways that you can build these narratives to engage with the players directly. It just takes some creativity, and most importantly, it takes understanding what your overall structure is so that you can make those stories make sense. So finally, the last thing you're going to do once you're done building out your chapters is repeat this entire process, boring down into much finer details for your first adventure. You're going to want to make sure that it's cohesive, that it stands alone. I think this is one of the bigger challenges of writing a big campaign, is that there's so much you want to tell them that the first adventure can oftentimes feel like a mess. Like it doesn't feel like it's all there, like you're just getting a piece of a story. No, the first adventure should be a tight, contained narrative. You could say, for example, be sending your adventurers to go clean out a mine after they signed a contract to do so without reading it. And that's it. That's the story. Go clear out this mine. It's filled with the undead. We need the mine cleared out. That's the narrative. That's the story. That's all it is. It is A to B. That's the only narrative you need. That is, by the way, the start to Band of Bravos. So spoilers, that's what they're sent to do. But obviously after just a few sessions, they quickly realized that narrative, once it's over, was only the first step in a much larger journey. That's what you want your first adventure to be. And in many cases, this is also that point where you can look at the first step and be like, does it actually need to involve the plot at all? Or can it just set the stage for the plot? That works too. So let's go back and sum up building chapters. Chapters are the milestones in the story. You want to build from the back, from the antagonist's goal. How does it happen? Who do they use to get there? How does that affect the world? You use that to determine where your chapters are. You use that to kind of do the if-then statements. If this happens, then this happens. If this happens, then this happens. And each one of those will help you build the overall narrative out into a larger structure. Repeat that process for each chapter, building the individual adventure seeds. That way you have a fully formed idea about what that adventure is about. Who's its antagonist? How does it resolve? How does it impact the overall story? Because each one of those should be something the players can complete. And once it's complete, then they move on to the next part. But they feel like they're having movement, that the story is evolving and growing. Look to build in unrelated subplots. These can overlap chapters in interesting ways. They don't all have to be resolved all at once. I find subplots that are things that you kind of do part of now and kind of do part of later to be some of the most fun and rewarding. Oh, there's a dungeon underneath this old tower, and you explore the first level, and it's got some weird stuff in it, but it's kind of mostly just a dungeon romp. And then you actually come back to it 4 levels later when the secret passage to the even lower level is discovered. And now the true purpose of it becomes revealed as a golem-making factory. Great. There were hints of that in the very early goings, but the story paused. Subplots can do that. It's great. Look for recurring characters and how to string them through the campaign, how their narrative interacts, how they grow, how they evolve. Maybe in the war between those two towns, in that deity plot line, maybe in that case, one of the towns gets destroyed. Maybe they do, their small skirmish boils over into an all-out war. Maybe maybe which town it isn't actually determined by the campaign. Like, one, depending on how the players pick sides, maybe one side wins, maybe the other side wins. And maybe there is characters from each side that you look at and go, that guy's going to come back for his revenge 2 chapters later. That's fun. That's exciting stuff. Look for ways to seed the future. Look at the end of your campaign, drag the individual elements further forward to see how they might first begin and first have their first kind of inklings appear in the world. If, this elemental lord has arrived in the region, all of a sudden gem prices went up through the roof. No one can buy gems anymore. All of the gem mines seem to be closed, or there just doesn't seem to be any gems to be had anymore. This is an ongoing, explosion of this effect that the players can feel. And trust me, they will feel it when they can't get the diamond dust necessary for their spells. When the prices on those get driven up through the roof. Use the PC narratives that the players are giving you. Build those into your campaign. Find ways for the player's story to be part of the campaign story. It is your tale that you're trying to tell, but it is a tale that is cast by the flame of the player characters. They are the ones who shine the light on your story, so you need to look to them for their character stories, their backgrounds, and work those into the campaign. That is a vital step. And finally, detail the first adventure. Build that out. Figure out how that's going to go. Make sure it's a cohesive story from beginning to end. All right, let's go to the final step here. Running the game. So, You'll notice that the next step was not repeat this process for every adventure. Don't do that. Don't build every adventure. Detail out your chapters, give yourself sentences of description, but that's all you need to start. You shouldn't go further than that, because you might be wasting your effort. And the reason I say that is campaigns change and evolve over time. Don't assume that everything you plan out is going to happen exactly the way that you envision it, because it's not. And if it does, it's probably because you railroaded the players through it, and that's not fun for anybody. So build your first adventure, build what you're about to play, but leave the rest a bit more nebulous. Leave it as its description, leave it as its summary. That's all it needs to be at first. Look for ways that your chapters can have some flexibility to them, and anticipate how that flexibility will impact the overall narrative going forward. Like I said, those two towns going to war with each other, maybe town A survives, maybe Applesburg survives, but Bananaville does not. Only one of the two fruit towns will survive in their war over this cow. All right, I've gone too far with this, but you get the point. That there is a flexibility in how that narrative will play out, and it may not matter to the overall end story of how this deity is trying to rig this vote, but it's important for you to know from the very beginning. Maybe the orcs that are subjugated by the troll wearing the intelligent helmet, maybe those orcs can be convinced to help you. How does that change the further narrative? Well, when the trolls manage to get the hill giant to pay attention to them and subjugate to them, the orcs know a way to convince this hill giant to leave the battlefield. Maybe they know the hill giant's kid. Maybe they can fight him. Maybe they can lure him away. There's always a lot of things that you can do to change up how your plot's going to play out while still maintaining that overall structure. The important thing here is that it gives your players agency. It lets their actions, their decisions drive the campaign forward. They can feel a tangible change based on the decisions that they've made. That's key. That's critical. That's what makes for a great campaign. Make sure to take what the players give you. The players, when they interact with your plot, are going to emphasize some things that they're interested in. They're going to ignore things that just don't catch their eye. There are going to be some places where you're going to want to play with that and defy their expectations and have the thing that didn't catch their eye still be important, because it'll come back later on and they'll be like, we didn't pay attention to that. But most of the time, you're going to want to take the things that they gave you, the important characters that they suddenly played with, and amp up their roles. This is another aspect of making sure that your campaign and your story has flexibility. Change out characters. If this one nobleman's supposed to be the villain of part 4, but they ignore him in part 1 and don't ever form a bond with him, but they do form a bond with this merchant, well, change the merchant to be the villain in part 4. It's the one that they bonded to. It's the one that they made an interesting connection with. That's fine. But you have to give yourself the flexibility in your story to make that work. You can always change the parts later. That's the secret. Those chapters that come later, they're not set in stone. They can be what you want them to be. The only things that you have to pay attention to are the things that you've actually let the players experience. Until it's happened at the table, no one knows that it's a thing but you. So you can change it, and that's okay. So I want to talk about two special things before I wrap this up here. One is, what do you do when you have to cut a campaign short? This has happened to me on several occasions, right? It happens to all of us over time. How do you wrap up a campaign? Well, fortunately, this is actually not incredibly hard. I think when you need to wrap up a campaign, the first thing you need to do is look at what chapters they've experienced, or what portions of the chapters they've experienced, and what chapter you're on right now, and look for a way for that to be the finale, right? And that sounds simple. It's often not. But like, let's say, I had the problems with the spiders and the Durgar leading to the elemental lord. I could end that at the Durgar. Yeah, a band of Durgar decided to move into the area, and they drove the spiders out of the nearby Spider Haunt Hills because there was a good iron vein there. And, that's the end of the narrative. Oh, why'd they come to this area? Yeah, they were driven out of their ancestral homes by the mine that they were in ran dry. It's the same effect as they were kicked out of it. It doesn't really change anything. Oh, there were weird things about diamond prices going up that you seeded. Yeah, that was just a thing that happened. Probably because, the mines in the hills nearby have all kind of started to dry up. There's ways that you can tie up your narrative in kind of a nice, tidy bow. You're not always going to be able to tie up every plot string. You're going to have to leave some kind of on the floor. But I look at it this way. Those are ways that in the future you can pick this back up and go on this adventure again. Nothing wrong with that either. I actually think the much harder situation is how to extend a campaign when you've run through all of the chapters you had envisioned. In some ways, this can be harder because the natural inclination is not necessarily the right one. I think the easiest way is to say, the main villain is actually just the servant of an even more powerful villain. The only problem here is that you haven't laid any groundwork for that, and you didn't realize it until you got to the end and you decided that you wanted more campaign to happen. If it happens earlier on and you decide to extend the campaign, that's easy. You just repeat the process we've already talked about here and start building in more steps and building in more foreshadowing. Because having a campaign pay off is all about understanding where you're going and laying down the foundation for the story to grow and make sense. That's really hard to do when you just come to the end of a thing and now you're doing the intelligent troll was just the lieutenant. He actually was given that helmet by a fire giant that you've never heard of. You can do that. But your players are going to stare at you like, and is the fire giant being controlled by, the drow as well? I've been here, done that. I think the better way to approach this is to look at the story you've already told, treat that as a complete story, and then look for the ramifications of that story. Look for how that story has altered the world and what might happen after it. If they defeat the troll, it might leave a power vacuum in the region that might be filled by a new threat. This feels an awful lot like, there's some fire giants now. But if you build it more naturally into the story, it makes more sense. So, let's say that elemental lord, they finally made it to the mountains, they stopped him from getting all the diamonds he needed, and they defeated him before he could open up a rift and suck the entire mountain range back into the plane of Earth. Great! You've defeated the elemental lord. Well, in doing so, you've attracted the attention of all the other elemental lords, and there is one in particular, the Lord of Air, the sworn enemy of this Earth Elemental Lord, who is incredibly gracious and sends its emissaries to you to invite you to its palace, where it has another problem that it could really use some help with, seeing you as a new ally. That makes sense. It's a continuation of the story. It's not the same campaign. It can be a coda to the current story. I always like to think of the Scouring of the Shire in this regard, because it's really not the story of the hobbits go and throw the ring into the mountain, right? That's not what it's about. The Scouring of the Shire is about returning home changed and different and adapting to a new life. It's about the ramifications of what happened. It's still very much a part of the story, even if it's not the climax. The climax is done. So, let's talk about the War God. They defeated the War God. They defeated his plan. He's not dead. He's been defeated and diminished. He is now their eternal enemy. He desperately wants to see them dead. There is definitely stories you could tell there that take that further. But in addition, the player characters have now been drawn into the politics of the gods. Maybe they were even present at the end of the campaign at the vote that didn't go the war god's way, just so that they could see it on his face as he was defeated. Now all the other gods are looking at these heroes as movers and shakers to be paid attention to. So, yeah. Folks have reminded me that the movies didn't include the Scouring of the Shire. That's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, obviously, they kind of skipped over that. But in the book, that was a critical part. I actually thought that was a well-rounded portion of the book. So, all things being said and done, the real secret here in running, building a campaign is putting down enough details to give you all the tools you need to tell this tale, understanding where it's going. You can't start a story without having a fundamental understanding of where it's going to go, which ties into your session 0 and talking to the players and what they want out of the story and all that. But from your perspective of building the campaign, you need to know where the story is going to go to get the story underway. But in doing so, you're going to want to build your campaign in a way that keeps it as flexible as possible. Gives you the most wiggle room in the future to adapt and mold that story as the players interact it and as they experience it. You are laying the bricks of this tale one at a time. And you can change the shape of what you're trying to build as you go along. But the things that are put down, those are the ones you have to live with. And you have to remember, the players get to lay down bricks too. And that's how you build this story. That is how you create the narrative you want to make. So let's sum it up. Running the campaign. Don't plan it all out at first, just build what you need. Add flexibility to your plan. Give yourself wiggle room. Give yourself outs. Give yourself permission to exchange bad guys and villains for individual chapters and pieces. Take what the players give you and use that to mold and shape the story. What they interact with should be what is important. Need to cut it short? Give yourself a way to chop off the tail and have the villain of the current thing be the mover and shaker behind everything they've experienced thus far. Need to extend the action a bit? Look for ways to build upon the consequences of the story you've already told. That's the most natural way to build your story out. And finally, keep the future moving while building on the past. Well, folks, that about sums it up for this lecture. This one went long enough, I think. So I want to thank you all for partaking in this tabletop RPG lecture. The series that I've been running on these has been very successful here on YouTube, and as a result, I am now a partner on YouTube. So thank you very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you're not a subscriber, please make sure to subscribe, hit that little bell so you get notifications whenever I post a new video. If you want to hear more about me and my work and the gaming that I do, the work I do on Pathfinder, you can follow me on all the various forms of social media, Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, which is where this was originally broadcast. All of those at /Jason Bulmahn, JASON_BULMAHN. In fact, these videos go live to a live audience every 4 p.m. on Saturdays Pacific time on my Twitch channel. They are also followed up by a live Q&A, so if you have questions for me, make sure to tune in and you can get your questions answered. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.